Well, at this point in time, I was 17 years old and had experience with marijuana, alcohol, ecstasy on many occasions, methamphetamine, Adderall, hydrocodone, morphine, heroin, codeine, oxymorphone, LSA, salvia, and various other substances and herbs. At the time of my experience, I was taking Lexapro for depression and anxiety. Being recently discharged from an inpatient rehab, I found myself craving some sort of high, so I talked to a couple of friends who said they could hook me up with some E. I didn't have any money at the time, so I went to the local college and pawned a few old textbooks for around $35, which seemed like a major ripoff to me considering I bought them for over $100 each. Anyway, I ended up meeting with my hook at around 5 in the afternoon and picked up 4 red ecstasy pills with a Buddha stamp on them. I had taken similar pills beforehand with the exact stamp, but there was something very odd about the stamp which I could not put my finger on. When I asked why the print looked a little more defined than previous pills of the same brand, I was told that they're new generation Buddhas. Having seen revised brands of pills before, I thought nothing of it and continued home. I was planning to save these pills for the weekend when I could do them with friends, but a voice inside was telling me just to take them, and being abstinent from drugs for almost 3 months, I chewed up the first pill at around 9 p.m. by myself. I noted that the pill did not taste very bitter compared to other ecstasy pills I had taken, but I thought nothing of it and took a sip of water. After I popped that pill, I sat in my room, put on some Mac Dre, and waited. After about an hour, I felt a slight rush, similar to a very mild MDMA high. I crushed up another pill and swallowed it with a large gulp of cold water. At around 11:15 p.m., I noticed that the rush I had felt earlier had gotten a bit stronger, and I was experiencing an Adderall-like euphoria, but not the lovey-dovey ecstasy high I was searching for. Knowing that it must be due to my antidepressants, I carelessly took the 2 other pills and kicked back to my music. About a half hour after taking these last 2 pills, I instantly knew I had made a mistake. I started feeling an overwhelming sense of panic, and my heart seemed like it was going to jump out of my chest, but I decided I was just having a panic attack and lay down on my bed, taking deep breaths and fantasizing about sex to calm me down and bring back the euphoria. This helped quite a bit, and I went a good 3 hours lying down on my bed and feeling alright, nothing amazing, just super speedy with slight hallucinations and distortions. I had been drinking a lot of water because the drugs had made me ridiculously dehydrated, and therefore had to urinate frequently. It was about 2 a.m. when I went to urinate that I noticed whenever I stood up to go to the bathroom, I would black out, my ears would start ringing, and I would fall to the ground. In my head, I knew this was a bad sign, but I tried to convince myself that I was merely extremely high and should enjoy it while it lasts. This thought provided a calming effect for about 3 seconds before I realized what a horrible mistake I had made by ingesting all those pills. I had to crawl to the bathroom to urinate because whenever I would stand up, my ears would start ringing and I would pass out. "This is bad. This is really, really bad," was what I kept repeating to myself over and over as I made continuous trips from my bed to the bathroom to urinate every 10 minutes, trying to pee as fast as I could while kneeling over the toilet so as to not pass out. At around 5 a.m., my symptoms had gotten worse, and I noticed my heart was going extremely fast. I measured it and noted it was 120 beats per minute when lying down, 140 beats per minute when sitting up, and I could not feel my heartbeat whenever I stood up and just ended up collapsing to the ground at every attempt. In desperation, I lay in my bed praying to God that he protects me, and I survived through this night. In my mind, all I could see was the crying face of my 10-year-old brother and my 11-year-old sister in my head after discovering the news that their older brother had died. Even though I was in a state of complete desperation and panic, I refused to call 911. I kept thinking in my head, what if I did call them and survived? Then it would have been all a waste, and I would have caused a scene with ambulances and sirens in the quiet neighborhood for nothing. It was with this stupid thought that I stayed locked in my room, crawling out only to urinate and come back. At one point, I was considering finding a water bottle in my room to pee in so I wouldn't have to stand up. At around 7 a.m., I made another trip to the bathroom to refill my glass of water and urinate, but something went horribly wrong. As I stood up to open the door of my bathroom, I blacked out again, and remember vaguely a short moment in time in which my head was in between the doorway hitting each side violently, accompanied by my arms and legs attacking the cabinets near the floor. I had noticed that it did not feel as if I was hitting the floor and cabinets, rather the floor and cabinets were attacking me. It had seemed as if the world had come to a complete end, and a part of me was sure I had died. I resumed consciousness from what I believed to be a seizure. On the other side of the hallway, my body laid flat out in the hall with my head in the entryway of my room. I had somehow convulsed from inside my bathroom to the other side of my hallway. I remember feeling calm, and it took a moment or two to realize that I just had a seizure. I ran back to my bed and laid down for the majority of the day in disbelief that such a thing had happened. After all, I was sure it couldn't happen to me of all people. I was invincible, right? I checked my pulse repeatedly over the day, and I noted that, as before, it was 120 beats per minute lying down and 140 beats per minute sitting up, and even though as time passed I was able to walk around, I could not feel my pulse while standing up at all. I immediately called 2 of my friends at 7:30 a.m. who have had seizures before from amphetamines, and they told me not to worry and to just lie down and sleep it off. Sleeping was out of the question, and I spent the majority of the day feeling very crappy in general and scared that I might fall down and convulse any second. This feeling lasted approximately 2 days after the experience, and I have not touched ecstasy since. Curious as to what could have caused such an event to happen, I looked up the pills on pill reports and found the red Buddhas were different because they had a belly button as opposed to the genuine Buddhas. I found out from this site that they tested positive for Piperazines and were responsible for seizures in a few other people. I have done ecstasy many times and in greater amounts, and such a thing had never happened. This is my first and only experience of piperazine-based stimulants. I never intend to repeat the experience or try any of its derivatives, a truly awful conclusion to a night. It was my birthday and I was out celebrating in the pub with friends. I had heard positive experiences of pep pills, which have been subsequently banned in the UK, so I thought I would give them a whirl. Some more experienced people may already guess a toxic end to the story as I said I was in the pub, and yes, to confirm, I was drinking alcohol. I thought I read that alcohol was best to be avoided, when in fact it should not even be considered in combination with BZP. Thus, I had already begun this chemical excursion on the wrong foot. I went clubbing and tried one of the 2 pills that came in the pack. I felt almost nothing, so after an hour I popped the next. My mate and his flatmate had bought some and done them both back to back as recommended on the instructions. They seemed very happy with it. My girlfriend had taken the same as me and at the same time, and like me, still did not feel much different. Another hour passed, and so we took a third, the manufacturer's maximum recommended dose. This is when things got better. The plateau was reached, and I felt very good indeed. Dancing was easy, and there was the desire to talk to and meet people. I don't remember the music sounding as it does with ecstasy, or any of the visual distortions, such as people looking really fresh-faced and beautiful, though hallucinations were only a step around the corner. I did not get any rushes, neither did my skin or body feel nice. There was just a consistent feeling of well-being which made me unaware of how my stomach and urinary tract were beginning to feel. As the night grew old, my friend who had also tried these pep pills was flagging a bit, so I was going to offer him one of mine. My girlfriend protested, and instead we did another. This was 1 over the recommended dose and did nothing but make things worse. Perhaps it delayed the cessation of euphoria, but I certainly didn't feel any better for it. Once out of the main dancing area, I became very aware of the hallucinations. I kept hearing my mate speak, although it was always somebody else, and I kept seeing people which turned out, every time, to be a handrail. However, I still felt good. By the end of the night, I was ready to go home and got a taxi, but just before I got in, I felt a sudden pang of nausea. I felt trapped in the taxi and completely overwhelmed by the temperature and ready to puke any minute. This induced the fear, and before long, I was battling with my own conscience like on acid. Yes, I was having a panic attack. I managed to keep it together though, and the taxi driver was no stranger to taking people away from clubs. However, at times I thought I might puke, and it was a 30-minute journey. When I arrived near my home and the taxi drove off, I was violently sick, somewhat surprising me because I had started to feel fine for the later part of the journey. Back home, things only got worse. I threw up about 3 more times and seemed completely unable to either swallow water or, if successful, keep it down without being sick. I felt very fragile and my body was unable to regulate its temperature, quickly fluctuating from too hot to too cold within a couple of minutes. My whole body ached, but especially the muscles around my scrotum, and I seemed to need to urinate every 10 seconds. By the time I had pissed in the toilet, dragged myself back upstairs, and got back into bed, I needed to get back up and do it all again, and then I wouldn't be able to go. I sometimes get this at the end of the night after taking ecstasy, but never this bad, and certainly minus the aching. I threw up once more and then became aware of my racing heart. I knew I was having a panic attack, but just couldn't keep myself calm. My heart was beating very fast, and I was very concerned that I might have a heart attack. Several times it all got too much for me, and I sat bolt upright with fear, not knowing what to do next. Living in a nosy neighborhood, I didn't really want the commotion of an ambulance, so decided on one last attempt to calm myself down, which involved quite simply drinking beer. This again made me nauseous, but either it kept my mind occupied enough or calmed me down until the panic attacks faded. Eventually, after 2.5 hours of mental agony, I was calm enough to go to sleep. The next day I felt rough to say the least. I didn't get out of bed except for a meal that was cooked for me, and then I went straight back to bed. Once the physical symptoms wore off, I had a week of panic attacks, and then maybe another 2 or 3 months where I had recurrences. These mainly happened when I felt my body temperature suddenly drop, rise, or noticed some other peculiarity in the way my body worked. I have not taken any hallucinogenic drugs since, and whilst I don't intend this to be permanent, I am a little worried that they may induce anxiety to a point it could become overwhelming again. Conclusions. I obviously did not react well to them. However, I am sure much of the come-down, hallucinations, and mental fragility could have been substantially reduced, if not avoided entirely, had I not exceeded the recommended dose or combined with alcohol. I know now that it is very important to consume water and piperazine-based stimulants, so perhaps my reaction was even dehydration sickness, i.e. inability to drink water or vomiting every time water is consumed. I also believe that my succession of panic attacks, and at the root of it, trauma, could have been caused by any mind-altering drug or situation if I believed that I could quite possibly die. I have had bad trips on acid before, but have not feared any repercussions to my health despite the fact I was scared witless for several hours. It did not persuade me to avoid LSD, neither do I believe I ever had a panic attack triggered from those nightmare experiences. My biggest concern about BZP is what it can do to my heart, and whether this is an effect of anxiety or whether anxiety is an effect of the racing heart. There also seems to be some common experiences of fluctuating body temperatures and body load. I would personally like to know how many people that had negative experiences took more than the recommended dose, and whether they had taken anything else prior. Taking any more than the recommended dose and/or combining with anything else is obviously quite dangerous, something I have not actually experienced with taking drugs before. My personal belief is that BZP and Piperazine blends are a lot less safe than the manufacturers let on or are aware of. Whilst you at least know what you are getting when buying these in the countries that authorize the sale of them, I would rather take my chances on the black market buying illegal drugs, since I previously never had an experience as severe and unpleasant as this one. I just want to say to everyone off the bat that if you buy an ecstasy pill, look it up before you take it. You never know what's really in it unless you use one of those few sites where people take photos, test for substances, and allow people to post reviews for the pill's experiences all in an organized search. This all happened to me last night. I finally mostly come down from the side effects, so I'm able to cope with what happened a little easier and write it out. A little background. I've been using psychedelics for about 4 years before this. I take tryptophan, a natural over-the-counter antidepressant, daily, which I found out probably made the reaction even worse due to high serotonin levels. I hadn't smoked marijuana for 2 weeks before this incident, which was a huge lifestyle change in itself, yet I was still binge drinking, and less frequently LSD and MDMA. I basically replaced the pot with more use of these drugs, which I realize is foolish. I had 2 injuries in the last couple weeks that were fueled by intoxication. One of the injuries resulted in cellulitis, a serious infection in my hand which eventually I treated with antibiotics. I'd basically been a mess and wasn't able to give up the rest of these substances as I did with pot. Last night I was already in sort of a bad mood, due to things generally not going the way I hoped. I went to a sketchy rave in a bad neighborhood with lots of lights that provided many visuals later on. My friend who told me how to get there had pills. He had taken one before I arrived, and when I asked him if I can get a few, he seemed hesitant. I had to keep nagging him to get them off him, which I realized afterwards was him not wanting to give them to me because he could tell they weren't good. I popped one and it tasted awful and crumbly. I started to feel a slight rush, but not very euphoric. I'm not sure what drove me to take the other two, but I did over the course of about an hour, thinking they were weak and hoping for a positive mood lift. After these three, I was feeling like I was tripping and having visuals, and at this point I suspected 2CI or something similar. Boy, was I wrong. Before leaving the rave, my friends and I asked a stranger if we can have a sip of his water. He had a small amount in the bottle but gave it to us. He looked super messed up, but we didn't think a thing of it because so were we already. I split from the guy who sold the pills to me and waited for a taxi with a few friends on the street. It took them what seemed like an hour to come, and I was getting extremely cold and shaky. Every car that drove by looked like a taxi or a cop car before it got close. A drunk old man outside of a bar was being short with me when I stood up, telling me to sit down. I finally sat back down when he said please. In the taxi, I got very nauseous and felt bad. When we finally got back to my friend's house, we all started to feel like we were tripping on acid. I looked up the pill I took on an Ecstasy data testing website, and it said Piperazine. We decided there had to have been something in that kid's water, but for all I know, I was simply messed up on pipes. My visuals got extremely insane, but I still managed to keep conversations for about an hour and remain positive. When my friends went to bed, I immediately started reacting badly. It was partly from being alone, but this was when the physical stuff got bad. I also went to urinate and it burned like crazy. Not much came out, and I had the feeling that I had to urinate nonstop for about 9 hours after this started. This is one of the side effects of PMB overdose, I also found out later on. I called out for one of my friends, let's call her Kay, to help me. She sat down next to me and calmed me with positive words and conversation to take my mind off this awful trip. I was having bizarre negative thoughts that I could not control, and they kept branching off and getting worse and worse. My body was convulsing, especially my stomach. I got up about every 10 minutes to painfully urinate. My body was hot as hell, but my feet and hands were very cold. My breathing was slow and there were long, uncomfortable pauses in between breaths. I told Kay this was the worst reaction to drugs I had ever had, and it only got worse. I tell her she should go back to bed and thanked her repeatedly for helping. I started to feel guilty, as if I was a pain to deal with, but she was very understanding and only wanted me to get better. When she went back to sleep, the psychosis kicked in full blown. First, I hadn't talked to my mother for a few days and assumed she was dead, then convinced myself she must be. I called her and my sister and made sure everything was okay and told them what I had done. While on the phone with my sister, I heard a click on the line, which I assumed was the police tapping my phone. My mother suggested I might have a bladder infection because I had recently finished some strong antibiotics. Later, I convinced myself it had moved to my kidneys due to the pain in my stomach. I agreed to come home and then had the same conversation with my father. It was a little calming. My ego is shattered and I start criticizing and judging myself for every negative thing I had recently done to people and myself, most of which weren't really that bad at all. I couldn't sleep or lie still. I eventually worked up the courage to walk to my house. On the way out, I hesitated at the doorway, thinking that if someone were to rob my friends after I left, I would be accused. Totally absurd, I know now, especially because they trust me. I went back in and told Kay she should lock the door, but barely got a rouse out of her. Upon leaving, I see a TV broadcasting a security camera. I think that if a robbery did happen, I would have looked suspicious on video for standing in the hallway and going back in. Each ridiculous delusion I had like this seemed extremely possible and real to me, and I couldn't rationalize these worried thoughts. I start walking down the street and feel as if I'm some kind of deranged Hunter S. Thompson character. I sort of feel like the old mom in the scene from Requiem for a Dream when she's having amphetamine psychosis and walking around the city. I started thinking of all the people who had ever called me asking for help finding drugs, and convinced myself they had gotten busted and were trying to rat me out in selfishness. I decided the police would already be at my home when I got there, if they didn't pick me up on the way. I give up walking and call for a taxi. The whole time I thought the police were listening to the call, and when I hung up, a man asked me if I was selling the newspaper sitting across the street. I told him no, but that he should just take one. He was taken aback and said he wasn't going to take any. The whole time I was suspicious he was working for the cops. The taxi came, and at first I thought the driver might be in on the scheme against me as well. After a while of talking to him, I found out he was from Nigeria, so I asked him about some Afrobeat bands from there that I listened to. To my surprise, he personally knew the artist Femi Kuti, one of my favorites of the genre. We somehow ended up having a good conversation. He got extremely enthused about it. I arrive at home and expect to see police outside my house. I go inside, and to my surprise, my turtles hadn't killed each other as I thought they might have, and the house was not raided. I frantically went into my YouTube favorites and deleted any songs that sounded violent or evil. I was afraid of being accused of being insane by the police, which I now thought I permanently must be. I started looking up symptoms of my eczema, which the doctor had already checked on twice recently, yet I was determined that my insanity was caused by something else. I then thought I might have a number of terrible diseases I started reading about, and called my mother, who is a doctor. She reminded me I was still out of sorts and not to worry. I had some DMT sitting around, which I had never tried yet, but I needed to find a hiding spot for it quickly before I got busted. These fantasies were as real as day, and I could imagine the police going through all my things, tearing them all apart. I decided it wasn't worth the risk and flushed it down the sink. I went into my roommate's room and told him about my night and what I did with my DMT. He thought I was ridiculous for doing such a thing, so I rationalized that I didn't need any more drugs, period. He seemed amused and wasn't worried. "You're alive though, eh?" he told me. It was true, but I was still scared as hell and couldn't concentrate on anything he was saying. He played some music which I thought all sounded terrible and too loud. Music, one of the big loves of my life, I thought might be ruined forever. I started slowly thinking maybe I would be mentally better after a long time. After a few hours of laying in my bed and constant urination, which slowly got more tolerable, I called another cab to the train station so I can go home to see my folks. On the cab ride, the driver didn't talk at all, and his baseball game on the radio drove me insane. I started to think that I was most likely going to die in the next couple of days and tried accepting my fate. This was hard to do because I was miserably judging myself for all of my choices. I watched as other people drove by in their cars and tried feeling happy for them that they would at least still be alive. However, they all seemed to be sinister and in their own selfish worlds to me. I'd lost connection to reality and all human beings on Earth. Even my best friends seemed like crazy people when I thought about them, and I felt like the most irresponsible and selfish prick in the world. I tried thinking of my idols and musical heroes to make me happy, but they quickly transformed into arrogant whores that were in love with themselves. I arrive at the train station. Although very antsy and unable to focus, I started relaxing due to the fact that I would soon be home from an hour-and-a-half train ride in the care of my parents. The train ride wasn't so bad, and I was in awe of the amazing sky and fields of trees. Upon entering my hometown, I started tearing up, which was actually a good feeling. I felt comfortable being in a smaller city and close to family and friends that I loved so much. My father picked me up and cried as I hugged him. I was so relieved to be there. After talking to him for a while, I felt almost sane. We made a grocery stop on the way, and upon returning to his car, another car started and I hallucinated a dark figure in his. I thought for a second his car was being stolen. I sort of laughed at myself when I realized it was in my head. At least I can almost differentiate my paranoid ideas from reality now. It took me a whole 24 hours to completely recover from all the side effects mentioned above. I'm still not sure what was in the water. PCP, ketamine, LSD, or maybe even nothing at all, and the pipes just did it for me. After talking thoroughly with my parents about it and assuring them I would try my best to be clean of everything for a long while, my confidence regained a small boost. I'm hoping to change my lifestyle in a major way. I was in a serious condition last night, and I very well could have died. People have died from Piperazines. All paranoia aside, I've read it's possible that I might have damaged some of my internal organs from this, but I'm going to check this out soon in a calm and positive fashion. For a whole 12 hours, I didn't even want to be alive, and I had completely lost all hope in my future. Luckily, I wasn't irrational enough to take my own life while in this state. By now, I'm mentally recuperating and very happy I'm still here. I hope to keep it this way.